Let's talk about Jesus Christ, Akhenaten, the pharaoh of the New Kingdom dynasty, and the teacher of righteousness that was mentioned in the sectarian scrolls of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now let's look at what they have, interestingly, in common and their connection. Akhenaten was a pharaoh who distinguished himself from the prior pharaohs in that he introduced the idea of monotheism to the Egyptians and removed the worship of multiple gods, polytheism. He was literally at direct conflict with the priesthood, who because of their ability to profit from the worship of the many gods, did not support the Akhenaten, the pharaoh. However, he pursued this. He was a pharaoh in the new dynasty, and he reigned for 17 years, approximately 1300 BCE. His worship was based on the worship of light itself. And this is a point where some people get confused. He was worshiping the sun. No, he was worshiping the rays of light. And there is a lot of parallel in the Dead Sea Scrolls as well as Jesus in returning in regards to the worship of light. Because if you look in the book of John mentions a number of times the sons of light and the sons of darkness. And as likewise, the Dead Sea Scrolls mentions the battle of good and evil, the sons of light and sons of darkness. And the book of John often uses the analog belief of light versus darkness. So this was all three of these entities. The teacher of righteousness who led the Essenes community, and in some of the writings wrote them himself, was in full belief of the support of and believed his community were the sons of light. Likewise, Jesus mentions that too, light versus darkness, and obviously Akhenaten did as well. For the Egyptians, this was a radical thought because he battled, as I mentioned, against the established priesthood. Akhenaten established a whole new city to bring the temples of worship out of the existing city where the priesthood had been so established. Amarna was its name. And again, as I mentioned, he worshipped light and he worshipped one God. And he also, interestingly, prohibited the painting or drawings of a god, representation, statues, and that like, considered a graven image. And let's see, we have that in the Abrahamic religions, really, particularly in Islam, which is strictly prohibitive of images of God. The city of Amarna, which he established, and this is where the similarities come in. There is a very focal similarity between these three entities, and that was that all three of them suffered persecution. And we know Jesus was crucified, and we know the teachers of righteousness was murdered also. That's in the sectarian scrolls. And regarding Akhenaten lasted 17 years. He was able to build a new city, as I mentioned, the Amarna. But as soon as his reign ended, it was overthrown. The city, it was destroyed and ransacked, and today all it is ruins now. There's nothing left there because it was deliberately destroyed. So all three of these leaders suffered in their battles against the prevailing priesthood, I would establish it, the religious priesthood, those who controlled religious beliefs during their times. That was who they did battle with and suffered the consequences for in terms of their sacrifice. And Akhenaten, it's interesting because the portrayals of Akhenaten that we do have of his image and his self shows him as a real person. He's not as the prior pharaohs had done, and as the pharaohs after him would do, present themselves in images of a strong, vibrant man, irregardless of his age or how he really looked. Akhenaten presented himself as himself and was featured in some statues and carvings that way. And he also allowed images to see his human side, interacting with his children and his wife. In other words, he was a real person. Although he was a pharaoh and he was the leader appointed by God to head the Egyptians, he nonetheless showed himself as a real person, and much the same as Jesus did in his ministry, as presenting with the people, not as a priesthood or a priest or a king type individual, but right with the people. What had actually happened to Akhenaten, we're not really sure of whether he was overthrown while in power, or whether the power transition was peaceful, and that after his reign ended, it was transitioned to, again, polytheism. But we do know these facts in terms going back to the connection of Akhenaten and the Abrahamic religions. We know that the coming of the concept of monotheism spread and was adopted by the Hebrews in Judaic faith. Sigmund Freud, a famous psychiatrist, wrote a book about Moses, who Hebrew faith considers almost as her father. Sigmund Freud wrote a book published in 1939, and he presented the idea that Moses was in fact Akhenaten, or at least a follower of Akhenaten that escaped when this revolt happened conducted by the priesthood against the belief in monotheism. So when we look at all these prophets, the three prophets, I call them prophets, Akhenaten, we look at Jesus, and we look at the teacher of righteousness, we can see identical behaviors and end results. We see individuals who stood up against the prevailing thought of the priesthoods that were in their time period, and as a result suffering death or overturning of their beliefs. Nonetheless, Christianity has prevailed. The final answer, the final culmination of these thought patterns was Christianity. Christ was last. And this kind of begs the question, were these three entities connected, or is there something ethereal, or how could you say coincidental in that they both, or they all, I should say, all three of them, had very similar life experiences regarding their willingness to stand up against current religious thought. And regarding these connections, it doesn't stop by that issue alone. In the Dead Sea Scrolls that have been translated today, there has been shown an indirect correlation to the earliest Essene movement in Akhenaten. In one of the documents that were translated, it was found hidden in Greek letters the name of Akhenaten. The letters were spread out, but when you put them together, the name Akhenaten. And as far as Christianity goes, John the Baptist, most scholars have now concluded that John the Baptist was in fact an Essene, and there is a logical argument that can be made that Jesus himself was an Essene. You can look at the prior video I made regarding Beyond Doubt, Jesus was an Essene. And one final thought in this myriad of connections between Egypt, Hebrew faith, and Christianity. There's a lot of things that have not been fully studied or disclosed. I wouldn't say studied because they're known, but they're not talked about much. And one of them, among other things, regarding the relationship of the Hebrews, was that Moses introduced circumcision to the Hebrews. However, it was a practice in Egypt for over 3,000 years prior, and therefore the connection was there. And as well as there are a number of psalms and hymns in the Old Testament that can be taken almost word for word from Egyptian writings that far predate the Hebrew writings, like some such from the Book of the Dead. Finally, it's interesting to consider that Jesus, when he was a baby, and Joseph and Mary needed a refuge, a place to escape, where did they go? They went to Egypt. They didn't go to an obscure area in the Levant somewhere or somewhere else. They went straight to Egypt, and that's where they found refuge and protection and safety. And then there was also the Therapeutai. This was a sect or group of people living prior to Christ in Egypt, and a number of Roman authors describe them very much in terms of their behavior and their lifestyle as the Essenes, although historians have been hesitant to connect the two groups, the Essenes and the Therapeutai. Their behavior was virtually identical. The Therapeutai, their name was healers, and just as Jesus did, and just as the Essenes, teacher of righteousness being the leader of the Essenes, they took it on themselves to be healers of people in their illnesses and in their darkest hours. And that was an Egyptian group, Therapeutai. And it's very, very connecting, the whole thing. Connecting Egypt, connecting the Essenes, and connecting Jesus. The Therapeutai, the Essenes in Jerusalem, and not in Jerusalem, but in Greater Israel, and Jesus. Same behaviors. And the connection to Akhenaten goes way back in terms of the history of Akhenaten and his radical approach to bringing monotheism to the world. And one has to give him credit as to being the one that introduced that, and as God's messenger brought it to a civilized world of Egypt.